visual feedback and incremental improvement tool. Kanban offers a flexible, non-prescriptive method for incorporating continual performance improvement, and it's rapidly gaining popularity as an easy and effective way of boosting effectiveness of both individuals and teams. So Chris is going to share with us some of his experiences as a software development manager at Sophos, as well as being a developer and a coach. Chris is always interested in learning about multidisciplinary techniques that lead to results, especially if they challenge the prevailing wisdom. So I'd like to welcome Chris, and if you have any questions at the end for the topic, Chris can answer them. And if you have any questions on all the interesting stuff that we've got coming up, it's myself, Michael, and can we have a show of hands from some of the other Junta members, please? Okay, so feel free to ask any of us at the end about some of our upcoming meetings, or share some suggestions if you have some. So thank you, Chris. It's all yours.
Switch gears here. Okay. Thanks everyone for coming out. Huge crowd. That's great. I see a lot of people here who were also at the Van Dev meeting in October, where I gave a very similar talk on the same subject. But I didn't scare you away, that's good. This is a longer talk. I've also revamped a lot of the material, so there should be something for you guys as well. So Kanban, it's as Susan mentioned in the little intro, it is gaining popularity, but it's not really huge in Canada yet, from what I've seen. There are segments of the world where it's really catching on. Europe, especially Scandinavia, there's a lot of very large companies buying into this. The Middle East, Israel is a huge component of Kanban. There's a lot of kind of major consultants and major firms there using it. South America is quite big. The US, Canada, slow adoption, but it's coming up. So I'll share a bit about what my experiences are, and with my personal experiences, an example of my board in the background, as well as what I've been reading and my communications and correspondences with leaders in the field. So I guess it's worth clarifying that I'm going to be talking about the Kanban method. So Kanban is sort of an overloaded term. English is full of those, as is Japanese, I guess. Kanban's a Japanese word. We're used to overloaded terms here. We use Agile and Lean, which have meanings and connotations within English, as well as we're trying to use them in a formal setting. We're trying to have them be meaningful so that we have a shared set of understanding. So I'd like to establish that first, because there are a few definitions of Kanban floating around. There's a few meanings that people ascribe to Kanban without necessarily being accurate. So cover those first. So Kanban with a small k, the origin of Kanban is visual cards, or signal card. That's the Japanese. So these are examples of Kanban cards from various manufacturing firms. One is German, there's a Toyota factory up there. So it represents a unit of work to be done. Kanban is a pull scheduling system. The idea is that you have these physical tokens that can be electronic. There's barcodes on these, so these obviously correspond to some sort of electronic system. But the idea is the downstream people pull work from the upstream. There's no, let's say you're in a manufacturing plant and one person makes widget A and they dump them off on the doorstep of the people who need to do something else with it. You say there's manufacturing and then painting. And in a push system, the manufacturers would make the widgets, and in whatever batch size they found appropriate, hundreds, thousands, drop them off on the doorstep of the painters and go back to making more widgets. In a pull system, the painters say, we can take more widgets now. And until that is done, the manufacturers need not manufacture more, because everything has to go through this pipeline. There's no use being faster than your bottleneck. So Kanban is a visual indicator, can be electronic as well, that there is more capacity for work. So in my example, the painters would pull a token. They'd say, yeah, we can do this work now. Feel free to refill that with one more token. And then the manufacturers can put it in there. I'll get much more into pull scheduling in a bit. Kanban board is also a use of Kanban. This is where many people know it from. This is an example of our documentation team here at Sophos from a few months ago. So this is very similar to kind of a visualization that is in several Agile methods. Each sticky note represents a work item. There's some columns that represent states. There's a planning state, a ready state, doing, done, and done, the always popular one. And there's swim lanes, these horizontal lanes. Each represents a different project. And then the total mass, total sum of all these tickets on the board represents work in progress. Every ticket here represents some sort of task, some sort of story, and it looks like there's a lot going on right now. So this is a Kanban board. It's useful, even just visualizing your work, but it's not synonymous with the Kanban method, capital K. So you can have a Kanban board where you limit some work in progress up, let's see if this works. Up there, that says 2 per person, that says 4 per person. So that's limiting work in progress. You're saying, well, we can't have any more than 4 in this state or 2 in this state. That's useful, but it's not the entire Kanban method. So the Kanban method, with a capital K, David Anderson, who's the originator of this and the author of the book on Kanban, is quick to separate small k from capital K Kanban, just for understanding purposes. So the Kanban method is a synthesis of several learning methods, of several kind of systems thinking, theory of constraints, lean thinking, all these ways of approaching learning. And it tries to take those and really get something that's useful in a generic sense, something that you can apply to any process, but not be very prescriptive, not say, here are the rules and you have to solve your problem in this specific way, because that doesn't work for everybody. There's no one-size-fits-all problem-solving technique. You can't just say, here's the answer to your problem, because everyone has different problems. So Kanban is a method the Kanban method is a way to find out what your problems are, and then figure out how to address them. So this is a quote by David Anderson on his blog, agilemanagement.net. Kanban method is an approach to incremental evolutionary change for technology development / operations organizations. Uses a work-in-progress limited tool system as the core mechanism to expose system, operation, or process problems, and stimulate collaboration to improve the system. Bring this down a bit. Incremental evolutionary. That's very different than something like extreme programming or Scrum, for instance. Here at Sophos, about 5.5 years ago, we had XP trainers come in. Joshua Karievsky, who spoke at the last Agile conference, he's speaking at the Lean Mini conference. He came in and trained the entire development organization in XP. We did a 2-week boot camp, everybody shut down, 2 weeks we trained, and now we're all doing XP. That doesn't work in a lot of organizations, either because you don't have senior management buy-in, or you can't afford to go dark for a little while, maybe you can't afford the trainers. So Kanban is different than that. It's incremental and evolutionary. You start with where you are, and you go bit by bit. Works in development and operations organizations. I'm not sure if there's much research in using a method like extreme programming or perhaps Scrum in something like IT operations, where you're not doing any development, you're just doing servicing tickets and things like that. XP probably wouldn't work because test-driven development on something that's just upgrading the server may not make much sense. Scrum perhaps, but Kanban works just fine for operations. There's nothing intrinsic about programming built in Kanban. I already mentioned work in progress. I'll get back to that a bit. It's limited. We say how much work we can do at once, and we try not to go over that limit. Whole system, I mentioned. Get into that a bit later. And it exposes system, operation, or process problems. Like I said, this is going to, if you use the Kanban system, it's going to make you look at your organization and expose where the problems are. Now, there's a risk of somebody coming in who's not in agreement with the process and saying, well, this isn't exposing our problems, this is causing our problems. Look at all our problems now that we can see them. So there's a fair bit of political capital required to get started with the Kanban system. You need to get agreements. But once you do that and you realize that these problems were here all along and now you're just exposing them, then you can work together and try to improve them. Questions, by the way, I'm good anytime if you want questions. There'll also be a bunch of time at the end. So how to get started with Kanban. In David Anderson's book, I've got a copy here if you guys want to have a look later. This is a pretty new book. The first book on the subject came out in the last 8 months or so. So you can have a peruse through later if you want. He's got several chapters on how to implement a Kanban system, or how to get started with a Kanban system in a company, with full knowledge of the fact that in Scrum or XP or many methods, you need this huge buy-in, cross-organizational, this is how we're working now, and that can't work for everybody. So he dedicates a fair amount of time on what to do to really get started piece by piece. I'll boil it down to 3 points instead of 3 chapters. Start with what you do now is very important. There's no point in saying, here's the ideal process, let's all start doing it now. There's going to be a lot of pushback. You probably don't know what the ideal process is. And there's, again, there's going to be people in the organization who don't understand why you're doing that. It's unproven. People may say, give you some data. So it's important to start with what you do now. Agree to pursue incremental change. So this is where you get your buy-in from your stakeholders, your product managers, people upstream from you, like product management, business analysts, people downstream from you, release engineering. If you're a development team doing this, you need QA buy-in. But incremental is the important word there. You're not saying you're going to radically change things. You need to lead with, we're going to change things as necessary after we all agree to what the change is. And respect the current process and roles. There's no Kanban master equivalent of Scrum Master. There's no radical shift of QA need to be embedded with the team, with having an on-site customer, like one of the core XP practices. There's none of that. Now you may get to that. You may find that that is a best practice for your organization by using Kanban. But Kanban doesn't say to do any of that. Kanban is very lightweight. It works on any process. You can lay Kanban on a waterfall process, where you have fully separate organizations. You can lay Kanban on a fully functional XP team, whatever you want to do. So we'll get into the 5 core principles that make up a functioning Kanban system, the Kanban method. Step 1 is visualize your workflow. So I showed a picture of a board before. There'll be a few other board examples, and I've got a full slide deck of board examples later if there's still time. Visualizing your workflow. The text that I took this from David Anderson's site, it originally said visualize the workflow. And I thought that was actually a bit misleading, because if you say visualize the workflow, you could ask which workflow. The workflow we have now, or the workflow we want to have. If you, as an aspiring dev manager, you say, well, I've read everywhere that having embedded QA in the team is good, and having test-driven development is good, and having weekly demos is good. So I'm going to say that our workflow incorporates all of those things, even if it doesn't right now. That's dangerous, because if you put something up that the team doesn't agree with, if you put up a board, you say, this is how we work, they'll all say, well, no, it's not. That doesn't reflect reality. Visualize your workflow. If you have a separate business analyst department, and a separate development organization, and a separate QA organization, and there's strict handoffs between those, then those are separate columns on your board. Put them up. They may change later, but you really want to start with where you are now. Limiting work in progress. So here's where it starts to differ from common knowledge, where you just, I think a lot of teams, if they haven't read, any Kanban theory or even Agile theory, if they, if you're a knowledgeable team, you probably have a board that shows what work is going on right now. Limiting your work in progress is what allows a pull system. This is where the downstream people, let's say you've got a dev and a QA organization. I'll show some examples of this in a bit. The QA organization will say, well, we can't actually take any more work right now. There's 2 of us. We've agreed that we can only test one thing at a time. So there's no point in development saying, here, test this now. Here, test this now. So limiting your work in progress exposes bottlenecks in your system. Because if you have a QA organization that says, no, we can't take any more. So dev says, okay, well, I guess I'm still holding it. If dev is limited with their work in progress, dev says, oh, well, we're holding all these things. We can't start anything else because we've had these things that we want to give to QA but can't. So now dev can't do anything. If you've exposed that QA is the bottleneck in your organization. I've got some animations that will make this a bit more clear. Measure and manage flow. This is straight out of lean thinking. Flow, lead time is very important. Lead time being from when you say you're going to work on an item, when you commit to working on an item, to when it leaves your system. Now your system can be your dev team, your system can be the entire company. So the lead time can be when a customer asks for something to when it's in the customer's hands. Mary Pomdiak, who's taught at the Lean conference a few years ago, she has got an entire book on the subject, or with the subtitle, Concept to Cache. That's the idea of lead time. Kanban wants you to measure your lead time and try to shorten your lead time, try to manage flow. If an item's on the board and it's been there for 3 weeks, that's 3 weeks of time that the intellectual knowledge, the time and money that was spent getting that item to where it is now, it's still sitting there. All that time is bottled up in this card on board. You're not recognizing any revenue from it. It's wasted time until you ship it to a customer. The focus is on getting your lead time down, shrinking it, getting things to the customer, reducing inventory in the lean nomenclature. And there's some tools within Kanban to help you do that as well. That really comes from limiting work in progress. If you're blocked on task and you say, well, that's fine, I'll start another task, and then you're blocking that task and you say, that's fine, I'll start another task, and that goes on forever, you have no focus on flow. Limiting your work in progress allows you to focus on flow because you say, well, this item is blocked, and according to agreed policies, I can't start working on anything else. How do we remove these blockages? How can we change our system so these blockages don't occur? Make process policies explicit. There's a lot of implicit knowledge everywhere, especially in software because it's a kind of a cerebral work. Process policies, if they're made explicit, if you actually write down or agree as a team how your team works, they can change. If you've got a manager who just seemingly on a whim dictates how bugs should be filed or when unit tests are required and when unit tests are not required, it's hard for developers or QA or anybody really to challenge that because there's nothing hard or explicit to challenge. You can't point to a sign and say, that sign's wrong, let's improve it. Making process policies explicit, the idea is you're standardizing. Standards have sort of a bad rap among technology people often because you think, we have standards here. That means 100% unit test coverage, and that means you have four-space indents and cuddled else's and all these kind of coding standards and like that. Standards or explicit policies, the idea is you make them explicit, but they're fluid in that the team can meet and decide to change the policy. But you make that explicit as well. So you say, well, if that's not a best practice anymore, let's change it to what is the new best practice. There's no one best practice, there's the best we know how to do right now. And improve collaboratively with models. If you've got a system that you can measure and you've reduced some variability and you've limited your work in progress so you're actually seeing things flow through the system, you get a kind of a rhythm, you can then experiment with that. Scientifically, you can do empirical experiments where you say, well, what if we change this and watch it for 6 weeks? How did that affect our lead time? How did that affect our defect rate? Experimenting is a key part of Kanban because that's how you know if what you think is an improvement is actually an improvement. So I have examples of these. So visualizing your workflow. Pretty simple. Let's say backlog represents the entire list of work that can be done for your product. Ready is when product management says, okay, you guys should work on this next. Development, dev, is when a programmer says, okay, now we're coding this. QA is when development is done with it. QA is testing. Let's say it's not an embedded QA pairing situation. It's over the wall QA. And done is done. Let's say ship to customer. So if you visualize your workflow, product management can load up some tickets. Development can pull a ticket when available. Product management is always ready with more requirements. QA starts testing. Development picks another task. And now we're done. So typically, you're just showing what's happening. It's more interesting when you limit your work in progress. So let's say that there are 2 developers and 2 QA. The developers say, well, sometimes we're blocked on builds, or builds take a long time, so we don't want to say we have a strict one work in progress limit each. Let's say there's no pair programming going on here, just one person, one item. And you say there's 3 for limited work in progress because you want to allow some slack in case there's a build going on, or in case you're waiting for a UI designer so you can't progress on one item. So you say, let's give yourself a little bit of slack. I can work on something else until the UI designer gets back. So you look work in progress at 3. QA, QA never gets blocked. QA says, well, we take a task, and we work on it, and then it's done, and then we pass it on. So, and there's 2 QA people, so they say, okay, let's have a work in progress limit of 2. So let's see how this works now. So the ready queue I didn't explain. Ready queue, dev and QA said, well, it takes us X amount of days or weeks to get things through the system. So there's no point of you writing requirements out for 10 items because it's going to take us months to get through those. So why don't you write requirements out for 2 items and then 2 at a time, and then as those go, you can write more. That way you're not writing requirements for things that may become obsolete down the road. So product management's ready. They've got lots of requirements. Development says, sure, I have free capacity. 0 is less than 3, so I'll grab a piece of work. Product management, always quick with requirements. Dev pulls another piece of work. More requirements come in. So now developer 2, or developer 1, whoever was working at that card says, I'm blocked. For some reason, I'm blocked. Maybe I'm waiting for the database expert to come in. There's a DBA, can't wait for her to come in, so I need to work on something else. And that's fine. We designed a work in progress limit of 3 just for this situation. So I start working on something else. Okay, now this task blocked. Maybe the middle one's waiting for a DBA, and the top one, that's waiting for a build. 3-hour build system, it's not great, but it's not out of the question in a lot of companies. So I got 3 hours to kill. I can only play so much foosball, so I need to work on something else. So I'll pull something. Except that we agreed that 3 would be the work in progress limit. So I can't pull something. So that developer is effectively doing nothing. Now, managers don't like to hear doing nothing. So what can that developer do? That developer can work to fix up either the tasks that are blocked here. Tom DeMarco has a great book called Slack, which sort of does away with the myth that full utilization, having people working on things 100% of the time, is a good thing. It's not a good thing. If there are any sysadmins in the crowd, if you've got a server running at 100% utilization, you've got a very slowly responding server. You don't want to go above 75, 80, say. So Slack, not working on specific value-add things, actually allows you to improve the system. So here, if dev can't pull a new task to work on, what can dev do? Well, dev can try to improve the build. And if that build's going to take 3 hours, why don't you take the next 3 hours trying to make the build only take 2 hours? It doesn't take many block tickets for that to make the build half hour. Maybe optimize the hell out of that. Maybe you say, well, we're blocked on this DB person a lot. She's out of the office a lot, or she's pulled between 6, 7 different teams. That happens with specialized resources. Maybe we should do some pair programming with her. So she's no longer a big bottleneck. Or maybe it's a user experience designer. Let's do some pair programming. Let's transfer some knowledge. There's still going to be a time when you need to go and speak to the expert. But if you can avoid these blockages, then these tickets can get through the system faster. Now, if there was no work in progress limit, these tickets would stay blocked. There'd be no reason to resolve them because you can work on other things. You're still busy. You're still adding value. And the lead time would suffer. These things would be in the system for much longer. All the time that's been spent developing those things so far would be tied up. That value would be solidified until you get out of the system. So success, the build finishes. That's wonderful. QA can start working on something. And dev rightly says, the person who just finished the build says, yeah, this build works, I can get to QA now. Then dev can start something else. And success, the DBA came in, she approved the SQL changes, works good to go. So another task is finished, goes off to QA. And now dev has done that task. But QA says, well, we can only work on one thing at a time. So I don't care if you're done. We can't do anything with that. So that gets bounced back to dev. And I'll mark that purple just to say, well, that's done. Dev's done. They think they're done. Normally, they just pile it on the list of things QA has to do and ignore it and go back to writing code. But here's another example of how limiting work in progress points out deficiencies in your system. So dev says, okay, well, QA can't take it right now. That's fine. Work in progress limit of 3. There's only 2 things going. I'll pull another thing from product management. So now I'm working on something else. But now, product management says, here's another requirement, and dev says, okay, we'll take it. Oh, we can't. So dev's blocked. Now what if all 3 of these tickets were purple? And all the QA tickets were still in place? That means dev, through no fault of their own, has nothing to work on. There's no build system to improve. There's no DBA to pair with. There's no UX person to pair with. Dev's just sitting there waiting for QA to finish. So instead of what you might do in a normal organization or a typical organization where you would say, well, dev will continue to write code and continue to put it on QA's plate, and they'll get through eventually. You say, well, we have a bottleneck here. What can we do about this bottleneck? So everything has to pass CQA to get to done, and we want everything to be done. So at this point, dev can say, well, there's no point in us writing code because we write code faster than QA can test it. Or QA tests code slower than dev can write it. So that's not ascribing blame. Maybe the code just does take longer to test than it does to write. That happens. But it's no good for the organization unless these things are getting through the system. So here, dev can say, well, how do we make QA not a bottleneck? So dev can do some things like running manual tests. Dev can get in there and say, you know what, I can't work on anything because of our agreed process. I can't work on anything. There's no use for me to work on something until QA is done. So I'm going to help QA out. Maybe dev will automate some QA systems, write some automated tests. Maybe the reason that QA takes a long time is deployment. It takes a long time to set up a test system. Once that's done, tests are easy. So maybe the dev guys can get together and work and get a system set up that it's a push button deploy and that halves the testing time. Your bottleneck's gone, your system can now produce value faster. So again, none of these dev conversations, these ways to improve the system would have happened if there was sort of a nebulous, slow QA over there that doesn't seem to get through our stuff. Living the work in progress and having having a discussion when you bump up against the limit there, that triggers this change. That's a catalyst for change. Any questions on that last bit? A lot of stuff on the side. Way in the back.
Is it possible that dev did a sloppy job and QA was to return items there, but now devs already have too many items?
Yeah. So the question is effectively, do cards move backwards, or what happens when cards move backwards? Kanban does not tell you how to design your board. So this is a sample board. Whether or not cards move backwards or forwards, there's no real definition. The sort of best practice in the community right now, the idea is to either leave it in QA, and that says, well, QA is blocked on this, and QA can then pull a developer in. And then you'll show later, I've got some flow management things later that you can see that will show up on reports, that something is spending a lot of time in QA, and then you can ask yourself why. Or it does punt back, that breaks the work in progress limit, and you have a discussion about that. And the discussion can be, okay, this is coming back to us because it was poorly written, or there were misunderstood requirements, or there's some reason this is coming back to us. So instead of accepting that as the norm, yeah, things come back to us, you say, well, this coming back to us is causing us to break our work in progress limits. That's bad. Let's discuss how we can prevent that from happening. Maybe we need QA input earlier in the process. Maybe the criteria that product management gave wasn't clear enough. Maybe the developer was just not doing best practices. They weren't doing, they forgot to run their unit tests. So maybe the outcome of this is to automatically run unit tests in the build. So the idea is not so much the rules about about where a card can move. It's having a team agree, these are the rules we're playing by. The rules can change, but only after discussion. And it's a discussion that's the important thing. That's how the organization learns from the system, is a discussion.
I have a question. If, let's say, on a ready state, you need not just product management efforts, but team efforts. You need also input from senior developer of how it can work, as well as from QA, how it can be tested.
Yeah.
How are you dealing with this situation? Like, where the team fits in here?
I mean that's good enough. That would be sort of an explicit policy you can have. You could say, well, in order for something to enter the ready queue, it needs sign-off from QA and product management and senior dev. And just schedule a meeting like you normally would and go over that. And then when everyone agrees, yes, this is the right thing, then it goes to the ready queue. So that's fine. This doesn't, I wouldn't count that as a task in development. Although you could.
It may require time and resources from both developer and QA, yeah?
So I mean, you can do that up front. That's usually first. You can redesign the board if it makes more sense to have a sort of a big blob area up front that can pull resources in for anything. That's fine. This is very simple. This is possibly the simplest board you can have. The simplest, I guess, would be to do, doing, done. That's what I have on my wall at home. I've got a few sticky notes with to do, doing, done. Personal Kanban is also growing in popularity, but that's a bit of a different subject because it doesn't take into account team dynamics. But yeah, I mean, that situation can come up, and we do that here basically. Product management doesn't hand us requirements. We work with QA and we work with development, and we just say, well, we do all that work, and then we put it in ready.
To get back to the example that you provided, where the dev capacity was full, but there were some items blocked, and the team decided to go to either change the build process or automate the test. why wouldn't be something that you would manage through the backlog? And where you say, well, we have identified that there are some issues with the with test automation, so we create some items in the backlog, rather than I'm stuck with my my three items and I cannot work on any technical item, or officially I cannot work on technical item.
So the idea is that you spend your time working on something to fix the problem. Right? Fix your problems when you find them. Now, you may get to a point where you say, look, we know this build is only going to take a few hours, and it's done. This is not a permanent blockage. This is, let's say this is part of the expense of working. So maybe you say, okay, maybe 3 is wrong. Maybe there's a very real chance that both developers can check something in, and then they're both stuck for 3 hours, and they both want to work on a new task. Then bump a little bit 4. That's fine. You had a discussion around it. You say, well, this is what we're willing to accept in our process. And then maybe, yeah, you want to follow it up with having a card in your backlog that you work on with next iteration, that you improve the build system, or you dedicate one day a month working on the build system, something like that. Or maybe everybody agrees that's the cost of doing business, and we don't want to pay for that right now, which is also fine. It's really up to the team to have the conversation about what's right. And that includes the work in progress limits. Now, you may get into trouble, and you may, if you say, well, let's make limit 6, and then developers can check something in, and while that's building, check something else in, and while that's building, check something else in. Then you've got a compounding series of things that haven't been tested yet, and that's probably going to lead to quality issues. Part of the reason that continuous integration is such a good agile technique. So maybe you go down that road and you find that that's not a good thing, you scale back your work in progress limit. But really keeping it low but not too low is important. The exact number, because you'll probably iterate and find out what the right number is for your team, what the agreed number is. Having a number that's too low, like if that was 2, then whenever anything comes up, you immediately need to challenge your work in progress limit and have a big team discussion. Yeah, maybe that's not good. Having it be 15 might as well not happen, because you're probably not going to be blocked on 6 items each at once. So yeah, it's something that can be discussed and changed. You first, and then you, and then I'll probably move on. There'll be time at the end.
Just wanted to make a brief comment that might be helpful in regard to what sometimes is done in manufacturing, where simply the defective product goes into the rework queue. The rework queue is handled by people who are expert at cleaning up messes. And so if too much stuff gets into the rework queue, then you know you need to improve your upstream quality and your upstream processes. But if it's just every once in a while, then you get your hot shots to deal with it as and when.
Yeah.
And then that helps expose it, but also not stop the stuff that's bread and butter to a lot of these stuff.
Yeah, and that gets into a bit of stuff I'll touch on later about common cause variation versus special cause variation. And if it happens very occasionally, then yeah, okay, we'll just deal with it. It happens. If it happens consistently, then maybe you're going to want to do something about it. One more?
What happened if the QA worked faster than dev?
So if QA works faster than dev, that's a good question. I don't have any fancy animations for it. Then QA is idle, and I've got a chart coming up that shows QA is idle. So either you have too few developers or too many QA. So it could be a resourcing thing, or you can say, well, time to get QA to pair with development to try to improve that. So that means development's your bottleneck, not QA. That'll show up, and I got a chart for that. That'll show up. You discuss it, and you see what you can do. Anything quick before we go on? Yeah, I'll get to it after. Okay, so measure and manage flow. This is a burn-up graph. People familiar with burn-up or burn-down charts? From a lot of you can see a lot of nods. So we use burn-up at Sophos. I don't have a line here, but let's say these are story points on the vertical axis, and let's say days on the horizontal axis. Measuring how your project's doing. Let's say you had a horizontal line at 20, that's milestone 1. Horizontal line at 30, that's milestone 2. You can do some projections to see when you're going to reach these targets. So this tells you something about your system. This tells you your throughput. It tells you how your velocity, how fast things are coming out the other end of your system. That's useful, but it doesn't tell you why. It doesn't tell you anything about how to improve your system. Sure, if that flatlined for a couple of weeks, then yeah, you may want to talk about that. You may see that maybe it dips here, it goes faster there, but just looking at this chart, it's good because results do matter, but it doesn't really tell you how to improve. So let's add a few more data points. Don't try to draw these by hand. So this is a cumulative flow diagram. So the green line on the bottom is the same line as before. Done. What I've done on top of that is this is completely fictitious data, not from a real team. I've said, okay, so the distance between green and purple, the distance between those two, that's the amount of work that's in the QA state. The distance between purple and yellow, that's the amount of work in the dev state. And the distance between yellow and blue, that's the amount of work in the ready state. So here, you're not just seeing what's done, you're seeing how your entire system operates, what the capacity of your system is. So you can tell a few things. So again, this is the total amount of work in progress. From ready to done, total amount of work in progress. So that's something you can measure. Here, for instance, QA was quite busy. They were working on 10 things at a time. This is probably a different team than the limits I showed earlier. QA was working on 10 things at a time. Maybe 10 was their limit. So you see that dev was working on almost nothing. The purple and yellow lines are quite close. So here you may say, well, dev's not doing hardly anything, and QA is really starved. Maybe before the graph gets to be 6-7 days into that, you say, maybe we can get a dev working on some QA things to speed that along. Here's an example of QA doing nothing. There's nothing in the QA area at that time. Now maybe, these are days, so maybe QA took something and then finished it right at the end of the day before the person came around and took down the measurements. Yeah, maybe that happened. But if that only happened for a day or two, if you had a long period of time where the purple and green lines were the same line, that means QA is consistently not doing anything or not working on any of these stories. That's probably a problem. Maybe dev's your bottleneck is somewhere upstream of that. Time to address that. So this chart requires writing down 4 pieces of information, 4 integers every day. 4 integers less than 10 every day. So it's not a lot of work to get this. Plug into Excel. Excel does this without any magic, and you can tell a lot of things about your system. So what else can you tell? This is reading vertically. So if you're reading horizontally, you get the amount of time in days, the lower scale is days. The amount of time in days, from blue to green, is the amount of time in days between ready and done. That's your lead time. That's the amount of time that, on average, it doesn't tell you anything about a specific item, but on average, things are in your system that long. So there, for instance, it's about day 5, day 4 to 10, about. So you say, okay, well at this time, our lead time was about 6 days. Okay. Well, look there, our lead time is from 10 to 20 or so. So our lead time is 10 days. So here you can see this big gulf in this purple area between green and purple. That's increasing the lead time. There's more work in progress, and that's bumping up the lead time of everything. So you can see directly here that increased work in progress increases lead time. There's a finding that's used in manufacturing and queuing theory, Little's law. It seems very obvious, like a lot of good laws. Little's law is roughly if you have the amount of time that a customer spends in a system. Let's say you've got a store or something. The amount of time a customer spends in that system is directly proportional to the number of customers in the system. Basically, if it's a busier store, you're going to spend longer in there. If it's an empty store, you're not going to spend as much time in there. So here, customers are work in progress tickets, and the amount of time you spend in the system. So if you've got more things going on, proportionally, maybe not directly linearly, but proportionally, you're going to have more lead time, and we want to minimize lead time. So you want to minimize work in progress. Any questions on that?
Well, it's more a question of burn down versus burn up. Is that typically what is used is a burn down chart, and it's what makes you use a burn up?
Burn up chart. So you use a burn down chart. You can basically 0 is release. You have 0 story points left. So you burn down, and you can project how long it takes you to intersect with the x-axis, 0, right? Burning up allows you to have multiple milestones. I guess burn downs do that as well, because you can have something at 20 and something at 10 and something at 0. It also allows you to easily see scope changes. So burnout only measures what's left. There's 45 left. And next week, you can say, yeah, there's 45 left. You don't know whether it's because scope increased by 10 points and you burned down 10 points, or if you just did nothing. So burnout doesn't tell you that. Burnout, if you've got a red line across at 20, which is milestone 1, red line at 40, which is the release, you say, well, actually this week you can see that my burn up, my done line, it did go up. But the expected release date went up, is no change because the red line, the scope, also went up. So you can actually see that scope went up and not just, it's telling you a little bit more information, and that's useful information. If your manager says, well, how come the release date hasn't changed? How come you didn't do anything? So, well, we did do something. Product management pushed more stuff on us.
So you're talking about burn-up charts and burn-down charts.
Yes.
Let's be clear here. Those are Scrum terms, and what this really is a cumulative flow diagram, which is a Kanban term. So we're different, correct?
Yeah. So it's building on what a burn down chart is.
Agreed. Yeah.
We don't do Scrum here, but we do burn down charts. I think it's more of a generic Agile term now. But cumulative flow diagrams have utility outside of Kanban. They're used in lean manufacturing and things like that. It's not Kanban specific, but I think bringing it into software is kind of more Kanban centric thing.
Great. But this cumulative flow diagram is continuum to the end of time. There's a burn down or burn up chart. It will be for a specific release.
Correct.
If it's a release, burn up or burn down,
Yes.
or it'll be for a single sprint.
Yep.
Or iteration.
Yep.
If that's the purpose of it.
Now, so you could say that you only care about things month at a time, or a rolling 30-day average, or a rolling 6-month average.
Well, the cumulative is always rolling.
Yeah, or you get a really big data set. One of those. Anything else? Okay, this is number 4 or 5. Make policies explicit. Touched on this a bit already. What does ready mean? You don't want to have things being put in the ready queue that have no definition of done or have no screenshots if screenshots are really required, and then you get into dev, you get into QA, and then you realize, oh, all this rework needs to happen because, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really giving voice to what your current best practices are, and putting them out there for discussion. They can be changed. In what order should we pull cards? That's a popular one. That's one I hit in my team a bit. If you've got a card that was prioritized by product management on the 10th of January, and another one that's prioritized on the 13th of January, which one do you pull? Well, I've got an explicit policy that says pull the oldest one. That way you don't get the 10th of January one languishing there, you pull the 13th, and then the 17th one gets put there, then you pull the 17th, and the 10th of January one kicks around. The lead time of that is going to be very large, so that's another policy you can have. What decides when dev QA is complete? What's the handoff criteria between stages? Another good one to do. And yeah, again, I mentioned this when I was talking about the work in progress limits. When something happens to violate a policy, question it. You don't deny it. You don't just say, no, I don't care that the build is taking a long time. I don't care that you can't improve it. Work in progress limit is 3. Full stop. You don't say that. You have a conversation as a team. You say, look, we agreed on 3. Was that misinformation? Did we forget to take something into account? Or maybe, yeah, we said it was 3. We should keep it at 3. Let's see what we can do to improve this so that 3 doesn't bother us anymore. But it's all a big learning exercise, and it's learning what your problems are as a team, as an organization. Here's some examples of explicit policies. This is taken on my board upstairs. So I've got entry criteria and exit criteria. So I've got on entry for the ready queue, success criteria is defined, team track or defect tracking software. It's been triaged to a certain release. There's a date in the lower left. That's when it entered the state. Exit when there's nothing new to help an in-progress item. So my in-progress is over here somewhere. And I basically say, before you take something to go and work on, ask around and see if there's something you can compare with, see if there's somebody who's blocked that you can help with, get things through the system. There's a sort of a forward Kanban mantra. It's stop starting and stop starting and start stopping. Basically, get things done and then start something else. Don't just say keep starting stuff. I've got some explicit criteria here. Choose oldest first. If you don't know how to do something, if the oldest task in here is something that you have no idea how to do, great, time to learn. Find somebody who knows how to do that and pair with them. And maybe that'll introduce some delays. Say, well, that person's not here for the week. Okay, well, maybe work on something else. But in general, we want to increase the knowledge. We want to make it not a bottleneck on an individual person. I got choose yellow first before oldest. These things are not written necessarily in logical order. They're written in the order that the team agreed on them. If it gets confusing, I'll rewrite the card. Index cards are quite cheap. Yellow cards are support requests. So if support asks us to look at something, we're not going to drop what we're doing in the ground and say, okay, support's asking us to do something. We're going to say, okay, support, you've got a question for us. We'll be done this task in about a day, so we'll get back to you probably 24 hours. And then when somebody has finished something, they look, they say, well, there's some white cards from the 12th of January, but maybe there's a newer yellow card, which is support request. Well, we've got a rule, look at the support request first, get that out of the way, then we'll go back to doing our white cards. That's the idea of classes of service, where you say, there's different types of work items. It's not necessarily a difference between technical debt and a story or a bug, but based on how you work on them, what order you pull them in, what states they go through. I've got some examples here of I've got an exclamation point, a yellow, and green. So green, I've got it is green, even though the character is washed out. Green is technical debt, so technical debt doesn't need to do investigation and test planning necessarily, but it does need to go in the ready queue. So every state that these things need to go through is written on the card. So there, red, something's on fire, production issue, major customer issue on the phone. So red needs to go into ready, although it'll probably be in ready and then I'll go grab somebody. A red is an expedite class. It gets pushed. I say work on this now. I don't care about work in progress limits, server's on fire. Yellow is, like I said, support requests. They go through different stages. I've got here coverage outline checklist. We do test coverage outlines. Jonathan Cole, who taught at the testing mini conference last year, I believe, he likes the idea of coverage outlines. And I've got things to look at when you're doing a coverage outline. This is the current best practice knowledge of the team. If that changes, we'll print a new sheet. But it's a checklist to go on. So the final core principle, use models to improve. There's a bunch of models, some sample ones. These are all from David Anderson's book. Theory of constraints. Has anybody here heard of the Goal, 1984 business novel? A few hands? Okay. Introduces the idea of the theory of constraints. It's really the theory of how to deal with bottlenecks and why you should deal with bottlenecks. So that's one way to do things. So for instance, what if QA is too busy for dev? Well, you can use the theory of constraints as sort of a frame of reference to change things around and suggest some policy improvements that may make that no longer a bottleneck. Lean and waste reduction. Lean is sometimes pitched as synonymous with waste reduction. If you're doing lean, that means you're eliminating waste. That's probably overstressing of waste elimination. Lean is really about flow. And even more, lean is about value. So if somebody says, we want you to take something, code it, and put it on the shelf, don't touch it for 6 months, and then give it to us. From a waste elimination point of view, that's awful, because you've got all that inventory tied up. From a flow point of view, that's awful, because it's a huge lead time. But if they're giving you a ton of money to do that, then yeah, value makes a lot of sense. So that's the lean economic model where you look at your value, you know you're delivering value, you know you're delivering flow, try to identify some ways to get rid of it. That's one way to look at things. Six Sigma from Motorola, W.B. Deming, who's credited with a large part of the lean manufacturing things in the 1950s in Japan. He uses things like statistical process control charts, SPC charts, the idea that you identify outliers in the process, look at the things that take over 3 standard deviations more than the average item, than the standard item, and figure out what went wrong with that and how to fix it, and you generally bring things into control. Reducing variability in your system. There's more. This is basically any way you can frame looking at a system and how to improve it fits into this. This is just figure out how to improve your system. So emergent properties, this is sort of the why you do Kanban on a bigger level. What comes out of doing these fairly simple rules, these 5 properties. You can end up prioritizing work by opportunity cost of delay. So what you can get by limiting work in progress and establishing what your lead time is, perhaps you can do that for different types of items, or you can just say, well, on average, or within 85% confidence, things that come into our requirements queue get shipped to customers in 28 days. Let's say that's your number. Well, you can give that to product management. Product management can say, what do I want out most 28 days from now? And they can have that conversation. So maybe if there's something that would be useful to have out sooner, maybe if I've got one item that's worth $1 million, but doesn't need to be out for 100 days, and you've got one item that's worth $100,000, but the sooner you get it out, the better. You don't work on the $1 million item because you'll be able to finish that in time. You have a 28-day lead time. So, on average, with you factor this in, you factor in some buffer, of course. Yeah, so let's product management actually prioritize things by how long it would cost not to do it, and how much it would cost not to do it. Optimize value delivery with classes of service. Again, this is the idea that you can push certain things through the system, like expedite cards. You can say, yeah, well, we're still going to service our support organization by having yellow cards or some other type of card that represents, the support guys getting a higher priority than regular story items. Spread risk with capacity allocation. So if you have limited work in progress, you can say, well, let's actually split our ready queue let's split things into a few lanes, like I showed on the documentation board, where we say, well, let's say our ready queue is 10 total, and we want 60% working on new work, 30% working on support issues, 10% working on tech debt. And then you fill those queues as necessary. So then you're actually, you can actually do that. Maybe it's not exact time, because maybe the things in the tech debt queue will take slightly shorter, slightly longer than the things in the support queue, but you're really you're allocating your capacity, and you can do that in a numerical way. And encourage process innovation. Kanban is all about having your team figure out what's wrong with your process, and there's probably something wrong. Something can be improved, and making it better. And it's innovation because it's not very prescriptive. It's not telling you, you know what your team needs to do? It needs to pair a program. You can conduct an experiment and say, well, we're getting a lot of bugs into QA. They shouldn't get that far. Or we're having a lot of knowledge silos. Let's experiment and see if those go down if we pair a program. And if that doesn't work for you, then stop doing it. You're really innovating within your team to find out what the best practice is for you. And manage quantitatively. The charts I showed, there's more types of charts you can do. You can do spectral analysis of lead time, where you find out what the groupings of lead times are. You can do lead time by item. You can say, well, support tickets generally get fixed in 5 days, and burning issues get fixed within 1 day, and you can basically look at the data you have. That's very hard to do if you're not limiting work in progress. Because if you go to a team and you say, how long would it take you, if you were just working on this, how long would it take you to do that? Probably about 15 minutes. Like, okay, can you get to me in 15 minutes? Well, no, because I'm working on all these other things. If you have these numbers, you say, well, actually, it can go in the queue, and things that go in the queue, that go through our system, take about this long, then you can actually start managing with numbers, instead of just lying in the dark. Okay, so wrapping up. Sorry, sure, go ahead.
One question on the last slide when you said spread risk with capacity allocation.
Yeah.
And you said, I didn't quite get the visualization. Is there sort of separate swim lanes or something?
Yeah, so let's say you have 3 horizontal lanes, and you say, well, the top lane, whatever it is, that gets 30% of my allocation, and 60 and 10. And then you say, well, the work in progress limit of that lane is 3, 6, and 10. 3, 6, and 1.
And if you have multiple projects, then you just have like 3 sublanes in each project or whatever.
Yeah, or whatever you want. Yeah, there's no kind of dictation from above as to what the boards look like. If that makes sense for you to do it. So more info. Limited Work in Progress Society is the place on the web for Kanban info. The Kanban Dev Yahoo group is an excellent discussion group. It's quite active. I've got 100 unread threads in my Gmail that I'm working through on weekends. I'm an excited guy. But it's a lot of good talk. There's a lot of practitioners, a lot of people who are doing this. David Anderson, who coined the term Kanban and came up with it, he is a very active participant. David Joyce, who's done probably the biggest rollout of Kanban at the BBC, he completely transformed their development organization. He's an active participant. A lot of really good people there. And of course, the book Kanban by David Anderson. Subtitle is Successful Evolutionary Change for Your Technology Business. So evolutionary is important. I've kind of stressed that this is starting with where you are and incrementally improving. And technology business, this is not just for programmers. If you're an IT team and you say we want to spend 10% of our time dealing with help desk requests and 15% doing this, you can set up a Kanban system and actually measure what your capacity really is. Okay, so done slides, time for questions, and I've got a bunch more examples of boards if there's time and interest I can go through. But there seem to be a few questions I didn't get a chance to answer.
Your burnout chart,
Yep.
I believe if I understood it correctly, it was based on the number of items in each queue.
That's the cumulative flow diagram.
Right.
Yes.
So does that assume that the amount of effort required for each item is roughly the same, or?
It assumes nothing about amount of effort. The cumulative flow diagram smooths out statistical noise because it says nothing about any individual item. So over time, it'll show you how your system's behaving. It's not going to tell you about any individual item. Reducing variability is an advanced topic. It's a elementary topic in manufacturing where you really want to reduce variability, and that's a lot of the lean thinking is around that. Not so much in software. If you spend a lot of time making sure all of your stories are exactly 3 points, you're wasting a lot of time and you're probably going to be wrong anyway. So nothing I've done so far assumes any sort of lack of variability in the story size. Now it's a great goal to get. So if you can say, well, our stories are variable because, in effort, because we're bogged down by our slow build system, or because we're waiting for a UX person, or because there's unfamiliarity with this language, you can normalize that by doing actions to address those issues. And then that's good. And that'll give you more predictability. It'll bring your standard deviations more in line. But maybe that's not the most important thing for you to do, so you don't do it. Yes? Okay.
Not sure I understand this correctly. I can completely understand the velocity of a team by what goes in the done column.
Yeah.
And without any bandwidth limitations, I can exactly tell who's too fast and who's traveling down the team. What do I need the bandwidth for? The limitations, because as a matter of fact, that's going to introduce artificial variables that, do the wrong thing by putting the wrong number. An empty column means these guys are fast. The column which tends to accumulate stickers is a bottleneck. What do I need the bandwidth for?
So if it's that cut and dry, sure. But how many stickers are too much? When do you have the conversation about that?
So are you telling me that in order to find out the 3 hours build is too long, I need the bandwidth? Come on, I know that already. It's a problem. The team knows. When the team decides together, they know already. I don't need the bandwidth, really.
So you've never worked in an organization where QA is generally considered to be too slow, and that's an accepted fact of life, and dev just keeps coding? I've certainly worked for one. Yeah.
Do all kinds of stuff.
Okay. So like most process improvement techniques, if everybody just got it, yeah, sure, you wouldn't need this. That's fine. If everybody always knew how to do the right thing, and we're in complete agreement and read each other's minds, and yeah, that's nice. This provokes the conversation. So yeah, maybe if you don't have work in progress limits, but if everybody knows what too many is, then you have a work in progress limit. So what does start to accumulate mean? Is if one person says, if the manager says, well, there's 5 things here, what the hell? And the developer says, well, there's 15 of us, 5's not very many. Then yeah, you're
You know, it's very simple. If after 2 weeks I have 3 extra,
Yeah.
I'm done in development. Waiting to be tested.
Yeah.
And after 4 weeks I have 6. It's obvious what's happening, right?
Yep.
They'll never catch up. So here's your volume.
So what if it's not perpetual? What if QA is not always slower, but sometimes slower?
That's fine. It's going to average out. No 2 iterations are the
Well,
same.
so it's not always going to average out. It means that if QA is sometimes slower, but sometimes good enough, let's say if they're good enough, let's say QA is your bottleneck, but they're not your bottleneck at all times. Development isn't shoving crazy amounts of work at them, but really they're the slowest part. They're not always too slow, but they're the slowest part. So they're the slowest part of your organization. This is straight up the theory of constraints literature. They're the slowest part of your organization. Your organization is not going to move faster than they move.
Yeah.
By definition. So why would you ever want them to be idle? You wouldn't necessarily, right? So maybe you say, well, yeah, dev can have more work in progress, but we have a separate little holding queue for QA. So there's a buffer. This is interesting, the idea of buffers. You have a buffer between QA and development, and you say, well, we always want QA to be working on something because they're a bottleneck and thus dictate the maximum speed of our system. So let's put a buffer. So if dev does work ahead and has something to give QA, they can put it in this buffer.
But the average speed has to be the same. Otherwise, the buffer is going to overflow. You have a producer and a consumer, and the producer has to be slower than the consumer. Otherwise, the buffer will overflow.
Yeah, but, yes, yeah, so over time, yeah. Yeah, but how is organizational change done there? Like, how do you have a discussion around that? It's very informal. There's no real talking point. You just say, it seems slower now. Oh, it's okay now. Oh, it seems slower now. Oh, it's okay
Same
now.
with bandwidth, because if the upper management is in denial, we're not gonna have any conversation.
Yeah, always true. Yeah, so,
Just to help to answer the question, I think the question is why you need bandwidth.
Yep.
And I believe you're thinking of it from an internal project point of view. But if you think of it from an upper management point of view, or from a customer point of view, your bandwidth essentially is your commitment to a level of service. And so that tells them what the duration is for any one Kanban ticket on average. That's what you're telling them. So yes, maybe you don't really need it within the project team because you know those things intrinsically. But I think if you look at it from a customer perspective, I think it's quite valuable.
But even then, my speed is the done. There's nothing else. I cannot deliver work in progress.
yeah. So the idea is this is a way to, rather than treating done as a black box where things magically appear in done, is a way to improve the steps in between so you can get done faster, on average.
Well, that's kind of like as an indicator for you, where you like in the productiveness or something like that. Like when, for example, when the task coming back to the dev, you can, as one of the persons said, you can throw it to the backlog, but for your entire team, that's kind of like indicator why it's happening, and you can improve work inside of the team and.
Yeah, but then I'm measuring something else. Number of defects when you go back.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of further to thinking, I think at a certain high level, this Kanban process you're describing allows us to see where the bottlenecks are. And so this gentleman is saying, well, I can see that without the machinery. And, in simple cases, yes. In more complicated cases, no. But I think the thing that I found interesting about what you were saying is that the pace at which you're doing throughput is not given by God or by staffing. Every time that you have a bottleneck event, that's an opportunity to speed up the pace, to rebalance your workload-defined techniques so that you can consistently and safely increase your cycle time. So it's not just about, gee, I've got too many guys in dev and not enough guys in QA. It's about, if I've got a mismatch there, how do I wipe out that whip so that it just goes through instantly?
Yeah, exactly. Like your idea, if dev is always faster than QA, that's going to be a problem. Yeah, correct. What if dev and QA alternate being the bottleneck? If you just let big buffers build up and you just say, okay, well, dev can do a whole bunch of work and get to QA, and then QA is swamped for a while, and then dev's not doing anything. If you're alternating those, you may not ever have the conversation that says, okay, well, what if we remove both bottlenecks, or we do what we can to minimize both bottlenecks? Let's say whenever we hit a bottleneck, let's try to make that maybe not go away completely, but less of a bottleneck, and thus improve the entire speed of our system.
I think it also helps in a scenario where you don't really have, this sort of presumes you have a lot of control over your resourcing, which, and I think in scenarios where you don't have a lot of control, like either you have a lot of turnover or there's just not enough people in the market right now to be able to bring people on board when you want to ramp up a certain bottleneck area.
Yeah.
I think this really helps keep it in transparent what is actually going on. Because when, a lot of these estimates and everything else depends on a fairly stable team, otherwise it's not really a team measurement. You got to restorm and reform and all that.
Yeah, this can also, in an organization where, let's say the devs are heads down over here, and QA is heads down over here, and the only time they ever, the only time dev ever thinks of QA is when a bug comes back to them. If you're actually talking about these work in progress limits, and you can get the developers to understand that there's, not a lot of point writing code that is not going to be tested, and like, oh, they're too slow to test this, let's write some more code. Oh, too slow, write some more code. You get the devs understanding this entire end-to-end system. Then you don't necessarily need staffing changes. You can get the devs to help out QA. This presentation does riff unfairly on QA just because they're an easy target, but I enjoy working with QA people. Whatever stage 2 or stage 3 in your process.
I think another benefit of this and Scrum as well is that it helps flag an organization more. Like you need less of oversight-full managers who are really looking at all of this stuff, and the team is very self-organizing and can see it from the process itself.
Yep.
This data comes out, or this statistic comes out.
And it's explicit. This is what we're doing. This is why, because we found this. Oh, it's not the best practice anymore. Okay, change it. That's it. You mentioned Scrum. This is completely compatible with Scrum.
I didn't mean to.
Yeah, I know. It's completely compatible with Scrum in that you can, if you're doing a full Scrum system, you can just put this on top. If you're doing a full waterfall system, you can put this on top. We're an XP team. We do this. If you put this on top, you may not continue to be a Scrum team. You may be a Scrum butt team. Because this may tell you something about what your process is, and you're strictly adhering to Scrum rules, and says, actually, that thing doesn't make a lot of sense for us, and it's causing a bottleneck here. Or we're doing something here, we'd like to change this around, we'd like to add some batching, because that'll get around this thing. So, yeah, I mean, it's fully compatible to lay on top of anything, but the point is that this is going to change your process. So. Let's get somebody else come back to you.
Yeah, you had in most of these you had 3 modified roles, BA, Dev, and QA.
Yeah.
Do you find that you have people who can switch between those when you see a bottleneck coming?
Yeah, so if you can't switch between them, now I mean, again, this is for illustrative purposes. If you can't switch between them, good time to start parenting. Here at Sophos, the team I run is a cross-functional XP team. So everybody tests, runs manual tests, runs automation. Everybody can program. So we're kind of lucky for that point of view. I realize not everyone's like that. So if you can't just switch resources like that, you can usually do something. Like in the example I gave where QA was a bottleneck, I guess that was all examples. Again, sorry QA. In the example, I said, well, QA is a bottleneck. Dev can write some test automation, or they can write an automated deployment script, something like that. That's still a very developer-centric task, right? So you can do that. Harder to go backwards. If you've got somebody who's classically trained QA person, very good at their job, just doesn't know how to code, then yeah, harder to go back and help with the build system or whatever it's going to be, speed up dev. So yeah, maybe that's a staffing thing. That doesn't often get to that.
Just to throw a couple more options out. Get a classically trained QA person, they make a great navigator.
Yeah.
Have them, even if they can't actually write tests, or you don't have a system like Cucumber where they can write like natural language tests, they can still provide a good framework for what would make a good unit test, what would make a good integration test. Conversely, if you've got QA people writing test cases up front with reasonably well-defined steps, developers are still monkeys, they can still follow those steps and test somebody else's work. You might need to just double check a couple of things, but they can at least help stuff move forward.
I'll go to you next. You've been waiting for guidance.
I had a question. You mentioned that you can put this process on top of any waterfall. I'm just curious. I'm trying to understand how you can put it on top of a waterfall. Like if you have real waterfall organization, how you can use it.
So the question was, I mentioned you can put this on top of any process. Can you actually put it on top of waterfall? Sure. You've got a column that's requirements elicitation, you have a column that's requirements analysis, you have a requirement that's development, you have a column that's QA, and you have all these columns, and things pretty much move in lockstep. That's pretty quickly going to tell you that, hey, there's it seems to be a bottleneck here, and that bottleneck is
Waterfall.
Yeah. so again, like I said with Scrum, with the example I said with Scrum, if you put this on a Scrum system, you won't necessarily still be doing a Scrum system if you take the learnings from it. If you put it on top of a waterfall system, I hope you won't be doing a waterfall system for much longer, because it'll probably expose some problems in your process. Like for instance, you'll get to the QA phase and realize that none of the requirements are still valid, and then all these things are getting sent back. Okay, let's address this. QA is blocked. There's no point of development doing anything else. So let's figure out how to make that not happen. And pretty quickly, you're not going to be doing 1970s style waterfall.
So your examples were mostly about Dev and QA.
Yep.
There's actually a huge benefit in having a few more columns upstream from that. So in the requirement solicitation, writing the user stories,
Yep.
And not just one, but maybe 2 or 3 different steps to groom the stories, making them ready.
Yeah. So moving upstream and moving downstream. So here it was kind of product management invents things and now we ship them. Let's say the team I talked about was internal team. They're a library team. They get requirements from other teams and they give final product to other teams within the organization. Completely internal. That could be an IT type thing, or it could be just a library team. What a lot of organizations have found, this was the case at the BBC, is the team starts doing the one team starts doing Kanban, and then the benefits are seen, the collaboration between upstream stakeholders where they get together and decide what the next priority is. These benefits are seen often because you're focusing on removing bottlenecks and increasing flow. Reliability increases. You've got some improvements. It starts to spread out on either end of the value stream. So maybe the people who are taking your library, they find, well, we're getting things that are a bit better quality, or we're getting them faster. Maybe we can talk about that. Or the people who are feeding you requirements, they say, I find that now that I'm only giving you 2 stories to work on at a time, I actually have a reasonable idea of when those stories are going to be complete. That's pretty good. Maybe we can feed this upstream. So it actually tends to grow. I think the term used in the book is a viral growth throughout the organization. It is sort of a grassroots type system in that you start with where you are on the ground, line managers, stuff like that. You don't need to make product management come and sit with your team and break down the wall between dev and QA, none of that stuff. Make business analysts get out of their building and come over here. You can do that if you get to a point where the benefits are visible for your organization.
The burnout charts seem like the tool you would use to communicate progress with people
Absolutely.
outside of the team.
Yep.
How often would you sort of go back to a day 0? I mean, how would you say it was each iteration or release, or how do you use that tool for milestones?
However often you want. One of these things that, again, Kanban says nothing about. Whatever you find useful. More data is good to have, even if you're not displaying it on a chart. So if you just keep track of everything forever, but you're only ever displaying the last 45 days or 60 days, you're right. If you keep going with the cumulative flow diagram, you're going to get something that is all green, and then up here in the millions row, there's a few other things. It really, if you have it on a level where you can remember what happened then, like you say, back then this diagram, I saw QA was very busy, dev wasn't busy. Oh yeah, well that was because dev was actually on vacation, but QA had a bunch of infrastructure work to do with their system, so that's what was going on. But if it's 6 months ago, you're like, I have no idea, that's not really useful, you can't make any predictions based on that, you can't make any changes based on that, maybe drop it.
One of the things that works well with Scrum is from your backlog, you set a bunch of TS and pretty much you get a small team and everyone works to the end.
Yes.
What I'm struggling to understand here is, let's say a scenario where your business analyst does your requirement, goes to development, finds something that's wrong with the requirements, needs to go back to the VA, an alternate station, or something. Now the VA is assigned to something else, therefore capacity they don't have time for this.
Okay.
What happens?
Then you have a conversation. What's actually the most important thing to do for the organization? Maybe that doesn't get done, or
Does
maybe
it
it's
go back to the ready queue to go to the analysis phase again?
if you want it to. Again, Kanban's not prescriptive. It doesn't tell you how cards should move around the board. As a group, you can get together, and your group should probably include a business analyst, maybe some senior managers in there if you want. If you're really going to have tickets jumping around, or you maybe just drop a priority on tickets. But yeah, you get together and say, well, what do we want to do if that happens? If we say, well, down the road the requirements were wrong. What would happen what would happen in a Scrum team if the business analyst writes a bunch of stories, enough for a 4-week sprint, and then goes off on a different project, and 2 or 3/4 of the way through the sprint, the requirements are wrong? What happens then?
Well, we have our BA in this one as well, so they do the analysis.
Okay, so if you have your BA sitting with your team doing this, there's no problem. Right? If you have your BA outside of your team doing this, then your method wouldn't work either. The idea is start where you are, right? So if you've got your BA in your team, excellent, you have no problem. The problem you're describing may be a driver to say, maybe we should have our BA in the team. Right? So that's the kind of conversation that Kanban wants to go. I think yeah.
Is there any
software that automates?
Yes, good segue. There's a lot of software that automates this. In fact, the first Kanban system, before it was called Kanban, in 2003 was at Microsoft. It was a distributed system between the office in Seattle or Redmond and Hyderabad. And they had a very high mature group over there. And yeah, they passed tickets back and forth, and it was all done with Team Foundation Server at the time. There's a bunch of kind of Web 2.0, nice rounded corners, Ajaxy type tools that are sprung up around this. One of them, which I will disclaim that I've never used, but when I tweeted about doing this talk, the person at kanbanary.com offered me 2 lifetime licenses to give out. So we've got some tickets here we can fill in and do a draw afterwards, but that's one tool at least I know exists because we've got free licenses. I know there's Agile Zen, there's a bunch of this stuff. If you go to the Limited Work in Progress Society website, they've got a whole section on tools, and there's things, everything from a simple downloadable, basically it's a wiki that you can just download a single file and chain around, to examples of how to do this in OneNote, in a shared notebook, to kind of full-fledged, so Kanban.com or Kanbanary.com that have a dedicated solution that you pay for. Yeah, so there's a ton of tools. It's much easier to get started with a board that you can move around, but if you have a distributed team, if you have all that type of stuff, it may not work.
I think just one comment to make about Kanban and Scrum in general, that these things are not really about how to solve your problems. It's kind of at a meta level, which is what surfacing the problems in both your tooling and your process and your people, whatever. It doesn't necessarily just say it's practically silent on how you solve those things once they're found. But it's usually the stuff that you don't find that's killing your project and your team and everything, morale and everything else. So that's what these things are really good for, about finding it.
I mean, Scrum does impose some rules. The idea of a sprint. So you'll notice in nothing that I showed is there any sort of idea of any heartbeat. There's no release heartbeat, there's no demo heartbeat, sprint, prioritization. It does not say when product management should get together and fill up a queue. These things are recommended, and you will probably find that you want them, but they're not part of the method. If you find that you can operate without these things, that's fine. We, for a long time, had opportunistic prioritization. Basically, whenever product management walked by our board and saw that there was a space open, they'd fill something in. Now, we've restructured our teams a bit. Our product managers, instead of working on 2 products, they're working on 9. Things have been kind of shuffled. So we don't trust they can walk by our board fast enough. So now we basically have an iteration plan where we've been doing no iteration plans at all for 2 years. We work on the next most important thing to do. And we still do demos, we still do things, but we just do the next most important thing to do. We didn't really find a reason to commit to a velocity. We didn't really find a reason to plan out at the beginning of a week or 2 weeks, whatever, what all the detailed breakdown should be. We didn't do any estimates, except at a very high release level. For individual tasks, no estimates. It'll get done when it gets done. If it takes too long, that never became a problem. So yeah, Kanban doesn't say anything about doing any of those. Now, for instance, we found that with having our product managers not being sitting the same bay as us and having more responsibility, they don't have as much time. We actually want to get together. So now myself and product managers get together on Tuesday evening or late Tuesday. We say, here are the next things that we want to do. Then Wednesday morning we discuss them with the team. The team talks with product management to make sure we have the requirements understood, things like that, and then we go. Now, let's say our ready queue has 6 items in it. If by the time of the weekends we've only actually done 2 of those, then product management and myself, we get together and we only discuss 2 more items to add to the ready queue. And then we keep going. Same things with releases. You can say you release every 2 weeks. You can say you can release every 8 tickets. You can say whatever you want. Not prescribed.
In this context, how do you manage the big picture or the overall architecture of the system? Because it seems like everything here happens. Okay, we take whatever comes next, and it's small bits. But who's got the big picture?
So you need to rely on product management not having the attention span of a goldfish, I guess. It can happen. So you basically, this doesn't preclude architecture. This is only the scheduling bit, right? This is like when to say do tasks. So you can have a big plan done up, and we've got a plan for one of our products that's takes us out, including beta and everything like that, takes us out to October. So we've got a plan, we've got cards written up, we don't have any detailed analysis done, and we're certainly not saying, you know, in Gantt chart style, you're working on this for 6 days and you're working on this. We're saying, okay, well, as we go, we're doing basically continuous planning. As we go, now, in this project that we've all agreed is the most important thing, what's the next most important thing to work on? If that thing is an architecture task, now you may not want to do a pure architecture task up front, you want to do big design up front, but you know, maybe it's time to refactor. You've done 3 cards and you found that there's similarities. Okay, well maybe we say, well, the next thing we do from the backlog or prioritize this next is a refactor into a pattern or something like that.
Are the constraints invariant to the iteration size? Does it matter if I go 4 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 day?
No, the concept of iteration is absent in Kanban.
Yeah, but I've set up bandwidth, right? And I am doing iterations.
Okay.
When I
Sure.
switch from 2 to 1,
Yes.
from 2 weeks to 1 week, do I need to do anything? Or the constraints
No.
remain the same? Story size would change, for example.
Yeah, maybe it will. Why are you switching from 2 to 1? It depends on what you're. If you're switching from 2 to 1 because you found that you know you're doing too much work and then you're scrambling to get things done at the end, and you know 8 days of work without a build isn't very good. Then yeah, maybe you'll need to change a few things in addition to the shorter iteration, like saying you need to actually check in every day. It really depends on why you're doing it, but. No, you should change your board when discussion that's prompted by the rules on the board. You say, okay, we have a discussion with this. Does it still make sense? No, then change it. If you don't need to change it, don't change it.
As a manager in the Kanban environment, how did it impact the conversations that you have with your boss? And did it impact the way your performance is measured?
So, that's a good question. How's my performance measured? Note to self. No, we've only been doing, we've been relatively gradually introducing this. We went to a Kanban system, but we've really done, for the bulk of the time we've been using it, the first 2 or 3 core principles. Maybe even the 4th. So we've definitely been visualizing our workflow. We've limited our work in progress, but we've sort of been doing that anyway. Not explicitly, but we've sort of been doing that anyway. We were just getting into doing things like measuring and managing flow, and we've definitely now made process things explicit, and that's already, I think we started that in the last month, and that's really, let's just say I've torn up a lot of index cards, because we said, oh yeah, this is how we think our process is, we're pretty sure this is what it is. It's like, oh actually no, that doesn't work, so we're going to do it again, but there's much more clarity on the team, there's much more alignment now. For management, so far, not a lot of change. I've started to get into the idea of classes of service now with product management. My entire team, aside from being a product team, we're also a maintenance team. So I basically asked them to define what our capability is, as a maintenance team. So do you want us spending 10% of our time on maintenance? If so, okay, then we'll set up our board so that there's that much capacity. They've agreed to the work in progress limits. We've been doing that anyway, like I said. They've agreed to the prioritization cadence, having Tuesday meetings, and then we discuss with the team on Wednesdays. Not a lot of difference in management that I've seen so far. It's kind of weird for my team because what we're working on is often a moving target. I manage a team of, in the last year it's been between 6 and 8 people, 4 products. We've done 40 releases. So there's a lot of stuff going on, but we're working on different stuff than, say, the year before. So it's kind of hard to compare apples to apples. Now I think that we're actually into a longer-term project. I think we'll be able to actually see some of the stuff that will go on because we are, we will get a bit of a standard process down and be able to discuss that.
So how about we take one more question and then wrap it up. One last question?
How often do you change the swimming lane? When you started, were the swimming lanes as you started, or you were adding or removing the swimming lanes?
Yeah, so the question is basically how often do you change the board, right?
I mean, do you add column? Like what I see, I would maybe add design column as a swimming lane.
Yeah, exactly. So I didn't change the layout of the board, not the content of the layout. So a mistake I made at the beginning was changing it whenever I had a cool thought that I just read on the mailing list. Yeah, the overeager manager syndrome. It didn't cause too much damage. That's good. But I've gone away from that. Basically, I spent I spent some time over Christmas setting up a new board based on a conversation we had with the team, with columns that we agreed on. The columns have been evolving over time over the last year, but on our columns, I put in an extra explicit customer acceptance step. We had that implicitly before, and it was implicit because the customer surrogate was always sitting right there, so you just tap them on the back and do it. Now that we've got a customer that's floating around the building, we actually have a separate column for customer acceptance. We added a investigation and test planning thing because we discussed that wasn't, sometimes we're forgetting to do that little piece, so we added a column for that to make it explicit. But I've agreed with the team that I am not to change anything, nor is anybody else to change anything, except in retro meetings. If something's blatantly wrong, if something says like, there's a critical fix required, then sit on it for a week. We'll change that if there's a typo. But yeah, pretty much we said we'll have a retro, we'll change things no faster than once a week, and maybe not even all. But then we'll say, okay, what problems did we have this week? Why is this card still here? Why did we miss this? Is there anything that we should do? Should we change entrance criteria or exit criteria? Should we change? Is this a new class of service? Do we treat this differently than other things? Is there a design column required because we're just assuming the UX person will be here all the time? Yeah, we do the retros now, but you can do it as often as the team wants to do it, really. You can do it at a daily stand-up meeting. You say, hey, what's happening? This didn't work yesterday, and it didn't work the day before. Okay, let's change it. Use strip tape on the board, new line on the whiteboard, and you've got it.
Okay, so to wrap this up, if you are seriously interested in